We're going to start out our day with climate risk. So Dr. Ron Dembo, unfortunately, due to this pandemic, was stuck in Portugal with COVID. So we have a video from him just for the forum. Dr. Ron Dembo is a computational scientist and mathematician. He was a professor at Yale University. He then founded Algorithmics, which he sold and then turned his expertise in risk to climate change. He founded riskthinking.AI, which is an AI-driven climate risk tool that is powerful. It helps all of us understand, from about our homes to major asset owners and managers, people who have mortgages. Right now they're working with an organization that has 6 million mortgages around the world to understand what's at risk from fires, from sea level rise, from hurricanes, and also with our carbon transition, our climate transition, with carbon pricing. What does that mean for their investments? You have steel plants all over the world. There's a price on carbon that has major implications for them. It will accelerate, the idea is when you have that information, accelerate the decarbonization of our system, knowing the risk you face if you're not ready for a price on carbon. So we're actually going to start, we're flipping our order, we're going to start with the video from Dr. Ron Dembo. He's based in Toronto, but coming to us from Portugal. And then Tyler and I will come back out and we'll welcome you and get going with our first panel. So please join me in enjoying the session with Dr. Ron Dembo and riskthinking.AI.
The subject of my talk is actually very, very hot at the moment, which is how do we actually measure the financial impacts of climate on our portfolios, on our strategy, on our countries? How do we actually bring climate under control? And one of the things that motivates us in doing what we're doing is ultimately being able to price climate into the market. That is, every single thing we'd see on any screen or any terminal or any stock market would have the cost of climate priced in. But to get there, we really need to first understand how to measure climate financial risk and opportunity. What I want to do today is actually take you through a really deep dive into how this is done. And of course, it's a very big subject. And of course, I can only do a small piece of it. But I don't want to pull punches. I want you to get a sense of what's behind the scenes. Climate has a unique nature to it. To measure climate risk, we have to understand not only what an asset is, but where it is. This is unlike finance, where a bond would be a bond would be a bond no matter where we trade it. So we need to cover the entire Earth's surface with information that would enable us to understand the impact of climate on any part of the Earth's surface and for any type of asset. That's a tall order. Let's take an example and start with a single asset. You're Brookfield. You've got a beautiful building. It's in Portland. Here it is on the map. And you notice it's not too far from the Willamette River. And we've seen flooding there in the past. And we know and we are scared of flooding being much more intense in the future. But we've also noticed that Portland has undergone heat stress unlike anything we've seen before. And the question is, will heat stress and flooding really affect this building in the future? And if so, what would be that financial impact? But if you were someone like a Brookfield, you would actually want to understand all of your buildings and what the portfolio of buildings might look like and what any new building that you might want to buy might look like vis-a-vis climate. So in this particular study, which we did for a New York bank, we see a number of real estate assets, and there's something like 52 of them, nearly 12% in 2030, that would be severely impacted by heat stress. And that grows to something like 44% of all the buildings by 2070. So an output like this tells us not only the financial impacts of all of this, but when we need to retrofit or replace a particular asset, and the kind of changes we need to make. In this case, it would be adding air conditioning, for example. But what's under the hood here is also something pretty scary. And that is, many of these buildings are actually seniors' homes located in areas of the country that have never had air conditioning before, or at least very little. And by 2050 and 2070, these areas will be more like Arizona than they are today. So imagine you own buildings like this. You have a fiduciary duty to look after climate change because it's a risk that you know about, but you don't. And someone in one of your buildings passes away because of heat stress. That is what we call an E, an environmental impact, that implicates an S, a social problem, which then will result in a G, which is a governance issue, in this case, a lawsuit. So let's take a deep dive into climate science. Here's what 10 climate models under many scenarios would look like if you were to ask them, what will heat be like at that point where this building is in 2030, 2050, 2070, and 2090? And if you went to 77 of the top world's climate models from the best institutions, you would see a similar picture, this haze of possible temperatures. So, for example, in Portland, the temperature of over 40 degrees Celsius is really, really unusually hot. And you can see a lot of this cloud actually lies above the 40-degree line, which in other words translates to there's a higher probability as you go into the future of you exceeding that temperature. So let's assume we started in 2010 and we looked at what kinds of temperatures we might experience in Portland. And essentially, if we went and asked all the scientific models of the time and all the individuals and measured things, all scientists, we'd see a range of temperatures, anywhere from 20 degrees at this time of year to above 40, almost 45. But we'd see in this tail of the distribution, there's a 1% chance that you will exceed 40 degrees. But as we go into the future, we see that tail grows. And this is what we mean by a stochastic or a probabilistic analysis. We can't predict the temperature in Portland in 2090. Many, many factors could get in the way. There's uncertainty in the science, as we've seen, but there's uncertainty in policies, the uncertainty in the economy of Portland and so on. But here we see that the risk of exceeding 40 degrees, or the transition risk for heat, will be above 6.7 times what it was before. So now we can take this a little further, and you can notice these tiny little squares or pixels, and there's Portland in the bullseye, but now we're looking at the entire Northwest. And as we go into the future, we notice that there are parts of the Northwest that become so hot that you wouldn't be able to work outside in that heat. That literally you'd risk death by doing so. Now, this can be applied to an entire country. Here is Mexico, and the middle part of Mexico is heating up. And by 2090, that part of Mexico will be as hot as Cancun is today. Now, most of that area doesn't have air conditioning. There are many, many poor people living in sub-normal conditions, and they could suffer terribly. And that's the kind of thing that we can measure. But you can do the same for precipitation, another risk factor. And you can see a similar thing happens. As you go into the future, things get worse and worse and worse, and the probabilities of flooding actually grow. This leads us to what we call the transition frontier. These are the various transitions in temperatures that we could see between now and 2090. But of course, any combination of this could happen. But typically, it'll lie between the red and green bars. And we call that the transition frontier. But now, we're faced with the entire world. We need to, in order to do climate change risk, in order to do it generically for many different corporations, for every point on the Earth's surface, we need to have all of that information that we just saw for the 1 pixel in Portland. And we covered this Earth's surface in our products today down to an area of 64 square meters, which is about the size of the shed in your backyard. Now, that leads to 33 billion of these hexagons. And for each one, the scale of this problem starts to become crazily large. In each hexagon, we have all of the history from 1850 to now, and that's both for the economics of that region and for climate. We have all of the future from now till 2100. And in addition, we get this from models, but we also get it from reading scientific papers so as to bring the data up to date. And why would we need to do that? Well, when the scientists, for example, recently discovered that the water under the Antarctic shelf was at a temperature higher than freezing, we immediately change our opinion for what sea level rise will be in 2050. So we really have to do this pretty much daily. That's over a trillion data points. And you might say, well, that's crazy. How can we do anything with that? Yet we, in today's world, with the massive amount of parallel computation we have, with the massive amount of data we can store, and the massive gains we've made in data science, we can do this in almost real time. So there are physical risks that are interlinked with these transition risks. And those physical risks sometimes take on complex forms. For example, imagine you were looking at Pacific Gas and Electric, one of the largest utilities in the world, and probably your pension plan has some exposure to it. Now, in October 2018, there'd been a fire, and I gave a talk in Sacramento, and we were looking at what possible things could cause fires in the future, and what ways should we measure risk. And if you looked at a single asset of Pacific Gas and Electric, it might be a transformer in a forest somewhere in California near Napa. And we know that those transformers spark when the drawdown is large, and they sometimes set off fires which could cause damage, which could cause severe exposure for the company. And lo and behold, a few weeks after I gave the talk, and we had a fire that was sparked by a generator of Pacific Gas and Electric, and that fire caused Pacific Gas and Electric to go from a $23 billion company down to a $3 billion company and bankrupt. Now, you hear a lot about net zero. For example, there are countries claiming that they'll be net zero in 2050. There's many companies that have signed up. Almost all the major banks have signed up to saying they will be carbon zero in 2050. But 2050 is a long time away. A lot of things could happen. And just, having viewed what happened just in the last year with the political situation in Ukraine, you can see that things can turn on their head in no time, and the risks of hitting 2050 net zero can be high. So the way that's done is we take scenarios, we take these distributions that we've generated, and from that we generate multi-factor stress tests. And those stress tests are applied to our portfolio or our company. And we see situations, for example, the far right, where a number of scenarios would result in large differences from net zero. In other words, our company would be beyond net zero. We'd have a large carbon footprint at that time, and we'll have missed our target. And we see situations where we'll outperform our target. This is useful because what it does is, if you have a distribution like this as an output, you have a lot of information to guide strategy. For example, the situations on the right where you don't make 2050 are situations that you might want to hedge. You might want to hedge those possible events. And the situations on the left might be the ones that you want to orient yourself towards in your strategy. Now, when you present all of this kind of information to a board or to senior management, you're typically presenting it to people without much of this technical ability or knowledge. And the notion that this might be complex, is fallacious. You can present this information in very simple ways. We, for example, have come up with a climate risk score that's really easy to describe. If I ranked you as a U3, it would mean that the stresses of climate cause you to outperform the downside. So you will do better than you thought, or 3 times better than you thought. So the chances of doing well are 3 times the chances of doing poorly. If you were a D4, you're 4 times more likely to have downside than upside. So we can explain that at a board level, but we can also explain it in applications. This is an application that's a joint application with a large custodial firm covering about 40% of all the world's invested assets that are listed. And in this application, we can compare your portfolio to a benchmark. You pick the portfolio, you pick a benchmark and a time horizon, and you can understand if the portfolio is likely to be impaired and how it might perform relative to a benchmark. You can also understand, as you peel this onion, what the policy risk might be relative to the benchmark, economic risks, all the way to social risks. So I'd like to leave you with one thing, that if you're going to look at the future, and the future is truly uncertain, you don't have a choice, but you'll be using models in one way or another. And those models are there not to give you a number in the future, but to give you insight. And that the form of a solution is a critical thing to remember. You might not know a lot about climate science, but you do know that in an uncertain situation, a solution, so-called solution to a problem, better look like a distribution and not like some number. I hope this sticks with you when you see your next report on risk management for climate. Thank you very much for listening.